This is the story of how Rwanda turned some of the most dangerous, landslide-prone hillsides on Earth into one of the world's most competitive coffee economies. Rain moves down those slopes like it's trying to erase them, sheeting over bare, red-brown earth, carrying an entire season's topsoil downhill in minutes, burying whatever a family planted below. For most of the 20th century, that was simply what farming looked like here. The steepest, most fertile-looking land in one of Africa's most densely packed countries was also its most dangerous to work, and a single storm could undo a year of labor before a single cherry was picked. Then, in 1994, the ground under this entire industry was pulled away. In roughly 100 days, around 800,000 people were murdered in the genocide against the Tutsi, and with them went the families, the labor, and generations of knowledge that had kept these hillsides producing at all. By the year 2000, this small, landlocked nation had exactly 2 coffee washing stations left standing. 2 for an entire country, in a place where coffee had been grown for nearly 100 years already. Today, those same slopes ship out tens of thousands of tons of some of the most sought-after coffee on the planet, earning this country close to $150 million in a single year. Coffee good enough that one of the world's biggest coffee retailers now sells a limited, high-end variety grown on exactly this ground. A trick borrowed from an old Belgian missionary's playbook, and a scattered handful of widows and survivors who refused to let a family's coffee plot die with the person who'd planted it, are most of the reason why. The hillsides never got any less steep. What changed was who refused to let them win. Rwanda is small enough to disappear inside most people's mental map of Africa. Roughly 26,000 square kilometers, about the same footprint as the U.S. state of Maryland, a little larger than Wales. It has no coastline and no border with the ocean. Everything it grows or ships has to cross someone else's territory first. And packed onto that small a footprint are close to 600 people per square kilometer, making Rwanda the second most densely populated country on the entire African continent. There is almost no flat land left to spare, which means almost every hillside, no matter how steep, gets farmed anyway. Coffee sits at the center of that arithmetic. Roughly 400,000 smallholder families now grow it directly, and once you count seasonal work at washing stations and the local trade that grows up around each processing site during harvest, coffee touches something like 500,000 Rwandan households in one way or another. Their cherries flow into more than 300 coffee washing stations scattered across the country's volcanic highlands. Hillside processing points that turn raw, freshly picked cherry into the dried green coffee that actually gets shipped and sold. In 2025 alone, that pipeline moved 23,860 tons of green coffee out of the country, earning $148.6 million, a jump of 39% in volume and 65% in revenue over the year before. The government's own 5-year plan calls for 32,000 tons and $192 million in exports by 2029. Put that number next to the rest of the world's coffee industry, though, and Rwanda's true position becomes clear. Global production runs at roughly 180 million 60-kilogram bags a year, led by Brazil at more than 62 million bags and Vietnam at over 30 million. Convert Rwanda's entire 2025 harvest into the same units, and it comes to something like 400,000 bags, a rounding error next to Brazil, barely a blip next to Ethiopia's 8 million. Rwanda was never going to outproduce anyone. The only door open to it was quality, selling a smaller harvest for a dramatically higher price per kilogram than a bulk commodity crop ever could. None of that should be possible on this terrain either. Coffee likes altitude, and Rwanda has plenty of it. Most of its coffee grows on hillsides sitting 1,200 to 1,800 meters above sea level, wrapped in mineral-rich volcanic soil left behind by the same tectonic activity that built the Virunga Mountains along its northern border. But altitude here comes bundled with slope, and slope, without help, is exactly what destroys a harvest. Rain doesn't soak into a 30-degree hillside. It runs straight off it and takes the topsoil with it. For most of Rwanda's history, that was simply the trade the land offered: extraordinary soil, on ground almost designed to wash it away. Getting both halves of that bargain at once, the soil and the slope, is the entire reason this story exists. Coffee itself isn't new to Rwanda. German missionaries planted the first trees in the early 1900s, and Belgian colonial administrators, who took over the territory after the First World War, expanded coffee growing fast, but for the wrong reason. The colonial system rewarded volume, not quality. Farmers were pushed to cover as much hillside as possible with coffee trees, with no incentive tied to how well any of it was picked, pulped, or dried. That built what growers still call a high-production, low-quality trap. A country full of coffee trees producing a product nobody in the specialty market wanted to pay a premium for. Then, in 1994, the trap became almost irrelevant because the country itself nearly stopped functioning. Over roughly 100 days, the genocide against the Tutsi killed around 800,000 people. The scale of that catastrophe shows up in the country's economic data long after the killing stopped. Rwanda's GDP fell by an estimated 58% that year, from roughly $2.8 billion in 1992 to about $1.3 billion by 1994. Agriculture employed close to 80% of the workforce, and it was paralyzed by displacement, destroyed crops, and vanished livestock. And even though farming recovered faster than industry or services, economists studying the aftermath found it took Rwanda roughly 17 years just to close the gap between its actual economy and the one it would likely have had without the genocide. Coffee trees, unlike people, don't die in 100 days. The physical plants mostly survived, still rooted in the same volcanic hillsides. But the people who knew how to farm them, process them, and sell them were gone in staggering numbers. Killed, displaced, or left to rebuild a life with nothing resembling the knowledge base a specialty crop needs. Whatever agronomic expertise Rwanda had accumulated over nearly a century of coffee growing was, in human terms, erased. By the year 2000, the evidence of that collapse was almost absurdly simple to state. This entire nation, 5 coffee-growing regions and hundreds of thousands of farming families, had exactly 2 coffee washing stations in operation. 2. Fully washed processing, the wet method that turns ordinary cherry into the kind of clean, bright coffee that specialty buyers actually pay a premium for, requires infrastructure Rwanda essentially didn't have anymore. Without it, everything the country grew was destined for the bottom of the commodity market, sold in bulk, indistinguishable from lower-grade coffee, at whatever price the buyer felt like offering that season. Add to that the basic facts of geography: landlocked, mountainous, a small population still recovering from catastrophic loss. And the picture the rest of the coffee world saw around the turn of the millennium wasn't complicated. A tiny nation with no port, no processing capacity, and no recent history of quality, trying to compete for premium coffee dollars against entrenched giants like Brazil and Colombia, looked less like a long shot and more like a non-starter. In 2000, a small, unglamorous development project called Pearl, the Partnership for Enhancing Agriculture in Rwanda through Linkages, arrived to test whether any of that could actually change. It was funded by USAID and built as a joint effort between Texas A&M University, Michigan State University, and Rwanda's own national university. And its plan wasn't to invent something new. It was to import, piece by piece, the infrastructure and know-how that fully washed, specialty-grade coffee production requires elsewhere in East Africa, and hand it directly to Rwandan farmers. Pearl organized smallholders, who'd been selling cherry as isolated individuals with no bargaining power at all, into cooperatives. By 2001, it had helped assemble 11 of them, with roughly 15,000 farmer members combined. Close to a fifth of those members were themselves genocide widows or orphans, rebuilding a livelihood on whatever family land they'd been left with. Pearl helped build new washing stations where the country's 2 survivors had been standing alone, trained farmers and station operators in the mechanics of quality, picking only fully ripe red cherry instead of whatever was hanging on the branch, controlling fermentation during washing, drying cherry evenly instead of however was convenient, and even helped introduce agribusiness curricula into Rwandan universities, so the next generation of processors wouldn't have to relearn all of this from scratch. The results showed up fast, in the number that matters most to a farmer: price. Combined income across those 11 cooperatives climbed from around $650,000 in 2004 to $1.2 million in 2005, with projections reaching roughly $3 million by 2006. For one member, a young woman named Epiphanie Mukashyaka, whose family had been killed in the genocide, the change was almost unrecognizable. In 1993, she'd earned about $30 a year selling coffee. After joining a pearl cooperative, that climbed to roughly $400 a year, nearly double what a typical Rwandan household brought home at the time. In 2005, the project evolved into a successor program called Spread, partnering with the agricultural nonprofit TechnoServe to keep building washing stations and training farmers as the model proved itself. But the person who embodies this turning point best is a woman named Epiphanie Mukashyaka. She was widowed in the genocide. Her husband and one of her children were killed, leaving her to raise 7 surviving children alone. Rather than abandon her husband's coffee plot, she took it over and taught herself the business from the ground up. First learning to grow and sell her own cherry, then using what little she earned to buy cherry from her neighbors as well, pooling it so the group could negotiate a better price together than any of them could alone. In 2003, with support from the Pearl Project, she built her first washing station, named Nyarusiza, under a company she called Buff Coffee. 2 decades later, Buff Coffee operates 4 washing stations: Remera, Nyarusiza, Umurage, and Ubumwe, processing cherry from as many as 7,000 smallholder farms across the Bufundo region. Mukashyaka became the first woman in Rwanda to produce specialty-grade coffee, and 2 of her daughters now run their own coffee export businesses, built on the foundation she started rebuilding out of a single surviving family plot. The model she pioneered didn't stay a single-family story. In 2011, an economist named Furaha Umwizeye, who'd returned home after studying in Switzerland, founded a specialty operation called Kivu Belt on the shores of Lake Kivu in Rwanda's western province, a region whose volcanic soil, high elevation, and humid lake-driven microclimate specialty buyers now mark it simply as the Kivu Belt. Kivu Belt's 2 washing stations, Murundo and Harama, process cherry from its own estate coffee, alongside more than 500 smallholders in the surrounding area, offering the same quality premiums and training that had worked a decade earlier in Bufundo. What began as one widow's decision not to abandon her husband's coffee plot had become, within a decade, a repeatable template other entrepreneurs were applying across the country's volcanic hillsides. None of that made the rest of the coffee world take Rwanda seriously right away. The premium end of the specialty coffee market has always been ruthlessly reputation-driven. Buyers pay top dollar for coffee from regions with a decades-long track record of consistency, and Rwanda, at the turn of the millennium, had none of that to offer. It had no coastline for easy shipping, a population still working through the aftermath of catastrophic loss, and an actual production history built entirely on the low-grade commodity model the colonial system had left behind. Against entrenched, generations-deep giants like Brazil and Colombia, a small East African country rebuilding 2 washing stations at a time looked, to most of the trade, like exactly the kind of long shot that quietly fails within a few years and gets forgotten. But quality, it turns out, doesn't actually care about a country's history, only about what's in the cup. In 2004, barely 4 years into the Pearl Project, representatives from Starbucks visited Rwanda specifically to judge whether it could supply premium coffee. It could. Starbucks picked 2 mills in the Cyangugu area, growing coffee at altitudes as high as 5,500 feet in the same volcanic soil this whole story runs on, and launched Rwanda Blue Bourbon as the 10th coffee in its limited, high-end Black Apron Exclusives line. In 2009, the company went further, opening a farmer support center in Kigali to buy directly from growers. A Rwandan farmer named Aime Gahizi was the first person through its door. The skepticism kept eroding from there. By the late 2000s, washing stations built through the Pearl and Spread programs were entering their coffee into international competitions like the Cup of Excellence, the same stage where Central and South American growers had competed for years. Rwandan lots didn't just show up. They placed, competitively, repeatedly, against coffee-growing pedigrees a century older than their own. By 2025, at the national Best of Rwanda specialty competition, 20 winning lots scored between 87.49 and 91.81 points under an international judging panel. And one of them, from a producer called K Organics in Hubei, sold at global auction for the equivalent of $88.18 per kilogram, roughly 14 times the average coffee price that year. The skepticism didn't get argued away in a boardroom. It got out-cupped, one auction at a time. Getting a Rwandan hillside ready to grow award-winning coffee starts with something that has nothing to do with coffee at all: reshaping the hill itself. The technique is called a radical terrace, a reverse slope bench cut directly into a hillside, its outer edge built slightly higher than its inner edge, so that instead of shedding rain downhill the way an untouched slope does, it catches and holds it. The design isn't Rwandan in origin. A Belgian missionary named Cyril Weem first introduced it in the 1970s, specifically to fight the erosion tearing through the country's steepest farmland. What's changed since then is the scale. This has become one of Rwanda's largest infrastructure programs, full stop. Nearly all of the country's 1.4 million hectares of arable land, by the government's own accounting, around 95% of it, has now been reshaped by terraces and drainage trenches like these. The technique is most effective on slopes between roughly 15 and 30 degrees, and it still holds up on ground far steeper than that, on some of the harshest gradients anyone tries to farm. Building one is almost aggressively low-tech. Communal work parties, neighbors, cooperative members, sometimes entire villages, dig out the topsoil by hand, cut the reverse slope bench into the exposed subsoil beneath it, then replace the topsoil and replant grass along the new risers to hold it all in place. A single terrace can be built in a single day of coordinated labor. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of hectares over decades, and you get a national landscape that has been physically rebuilt, one hillside at a time, by the people who farm it. On terraced ground, the coffee itself is grown almost entirely on tiny family plots, mostly the red bourbon variety, and harvested under a rule that used to be optional and is now central to the entire quality strategy. Pick only the fully ripe red cherry and leave the green ones on the branch for another pass. That's a direct reversal of the old colonial-era habit of stripping a branch clean regardless of ripeness. And it's one of the cheapest, highest-impact changes a farmer can make, because unripe cherry is one of the fastest ways to ruin an otherwise perfect batch. From there, the cherry travels to one of the country's 300-plus washing stations, where it goes through full wet processing, pulped to strip away the outer skin, fermented in tanks to loosen the sticky mucilage layer underneath, washed clean in channels of running water, then laid out to dry slowly and evenly on raised beds. Every batch gets cupped, professionally tasted and scored, before it's graded, and the highest scoring lots are the ones that go on to compete in events like the Cup of Excellence and the National Best of Rwanda competition, under oversight from the country's National Agricultural Export Development Board. At the height of harvest, a single busy washing station can bring on 50 to 70 seasonal workers, just to keep cherry moving from intake to drying bed without a backlog. Multiplied across 300-plus stations nationwide, processing season itself becomes one of rural Rwanda's biggest sources of temporary paid work. None of this came together without real friction along the way. In 2016, the government introduced a zoning law that locked each washing station to a fixed catchment of farmers, requiring cherry to be sold only within an assigned district, an attempt to build stable, long-term relationships between growers and processors instead of a chaotic bidding free-for-all. It worked for a while. But in June 2023, the policy was revoked, and the 2024 harvest was the first grown under a fully open market, where any washing station could buy cherry from any farmer, anywhere. The result wasn't the smooth efficiency gain regulators hoped for. Competition for cherry turned fierce almost overnight. Prices spiked as stations bid against each other for the same limited supply, and margins at many washing stations were squeezed hard enough that capacity utilization, how much of a station's actual processing capacity gets used in a season, fell from around 66% in 2023 to just 56% in 2024. Layer drought stress in the eastern growing regions on top of that, and the 2025 to 26 harvest forecast of roughly 18,000 tons makes one thing clear. This recovery was never a straight line upward, and it still isn't. Climate change is adding a newer, less resolved threat on top of that market disruption. Coffee leaf rust, a fungal disease that costs the global coffee industry an estimated $1 to $2 billion a year, has historically been kept in check at Rwanda's higher elevations, where the fungus struggled to survive in cooler air. But as the climate warms, the disease is moving uphill into terrain that used to be safe, threatening the same high-altitude plots the terracing program worked so hard to stabilize. And effective fungicides remain too expensive for most smallholders to use routinely. It's a problem without a tidy resolution yet, layered on top of a market still adjusting to its first zoning-free harvest. Coffee is the headline, but it's not actually the entire bet. The terracing program that made specialty coffee possible was never built for coffee alone. It's a nationwide land management strategy, reported at a cost north of $300 million, that touches nearly every crop grown on Rwandan soil. The same reverse slope benches that hold a coffee plot in place during a downpour do the same job for beans, bananas, and cassava on the hillside next door. The clearest evidence of what that buys shows up in a single watershed, the Sebeya catchment in Rwanda's western province, one of the most intensively studied basins in the country. Soil erosion there fell by close to 90%, according to farmers and researchers tracking the results of terracing, afforestation, and drainage ditch work in the area. Measured soil loss dropped from roughly 112 tons per hectare per year in 2015 to about 100 tons in 2018, and down again to around 87 tons by 2022. Slow the water down on a hillside, and you don't just save one harvest. You cut flooding lower in the valley, protect the water quality of the rivers those hillsides drain into, and keep topsoil in the fields instead of in the riverbed downstream. That work fits inside a much larger government bet too. Rwanda's Vision 2020 and Vision 2050 development plans both treat agriculture as something to be pulled out of subsistence farming entirely, pushed toward commercial, technology-driven production, with a stated goal of 100% irrigation coverage on irrigable land by 2050. Coffee happens to be the export where Rwanda's quality strategy shows up most clearly in hard dollar figures, sitting alongside tea, avocados, macadamia nuts, and other high-value crops the country is betting on for the same reason. A small footprint of land simply cannot compete on volume, so nearly every strategic choice is built around extracting more value per hectare instead. The terraces themselves don't know or care that they're growing coffee. They'd hold the hillside together either way. That diversification shows up in the export ledger too. In the 2023/24 season, tea earned Rwanda $114.8 million from just over 38,000 tons. A scale of revenue close enough to coffee's that the two crops now function as twin pillars of the country's export strategy, rather than one dominant crop and a handful of afterthoughts. The social shift running underneath all of it is just as striking as the export numbers. Women now make up 57% of Rwanda's coffee growers and around 70% of the sector's total workforce, and their leadership has moved well past growing the cherry. Stations like Humure and Imbalima are run entirely by women's cooperatives. Glorios became the first woman to manage a washing station in the country at Ruli Mountain, and a station built in 2003 with USAID backing near Sake Farm still operates today, staffed only by women, under the name it earned early on, the Women's Wash Station. Mukashyaka's story wasn't an exception the industry tolerated. It became close to the norm. Run the numbers from both ends of this story side by side, and the distance covered stops being abstract. In the year 2000, Rwanda had 2 coffee washing stations. Today, it has more than 300. In 2000, virtually the entire crop sold as low-grade commodity coffee, priced at whatever the bulk market would offer that season. Today, one of the world's biggest coffee retailers sells a limited, high-end Rwandan blue bourbon at a premium. Rwandan lots regularly place in international specialty competitions, and in 2025, 20 of them scored as high as 91.81 points at the National Best of Rwanda competition, with the top lot selling at auction for $88.18 a kilogram, about 14 times an ordinary year's average price. In 2024, the country exported 17,142 tons of coffee for $89.8 million. 1 year later, in 2025, that had climbed to 23,860 tons for $148.6 million, a 39% jump in volume and a 65% jump in revenue in a single harvest cycle. And the human version of that same arc is sitting in the Bufundo region, where Epiphanie Mukashyaka's single surviving coffee plot has become 4 working washing stations, processing cherry from roughly 7,000 farming families, with 2 of her own daughters now running their own export businesses on the foundation she rebuilt with nothing but a plot of land and a decision not to let it go to waste. A generation earlier, a young woman like Epiphanie Mukashyaka was earning $30 a year from the same crop. Within a cooperative built on the same model, that number multiplied more than tenfold. Rwanda's hillsides are no less steep than they were in 1994. The rain that falls on them hasn't gotten any gentler, and the volcanic soil underneath hasn't gotten any less prone to washing away the moment it's given the chance. What changed wasn't the land. It was a decision repeated hundreds of thousands of times over 2 decades, by aid programs, by government planners, and most of all by individual farmers who had every reason to walk away from a devastated plot of ground and instead chose to dig a terrace, plant a tree, and try again. That single industry's arc mirrors the country's much larger one. Rwanda's economy needed roughly 17 years just to close the gap with where it would have been without the genocide, then went on to post 25 uninterrupted years of growth between 1996 and 2020. Coffee is a small, specific thread inside that much larger recovery, but it's a thread you can taste, and one whose price tag is public record every single harvest. That's the part of this story that's easy to miss inside all the tonnage figures and export dollars. An industry that had, by any reasonable measure, been erased down to 2 working washing stations, was rebuilt hillside by hillside by the people who had the least reason to trust that hard work on that ground would ever pay off again. If stories like this, where the harshest, most damaged land on Earth gets turned into something the whole world wants, are the kind of thing you want more of, subscribe, because next time we're heading somewhere just as unlikely.